ancient Egypt, a land of intrigue, mystery, and an unsolved murder. 3,000 years ago, a boy was chosen to deliver his kingdom from chaos. The boy grew up to be a living god. But the god proved mortal. Tutankhamun, most famous of all the pharaohs, died before his 20th year. Cause of death, a mystery. Now, two of America's finest detectives set out to discover the truth behind Tut's suspicious death. They're convinced he was murdered. From hostile badlands to eerie tombs, the hunt for clues will take the detectives all over Egypt on a groundbreaking case. Who murdered Tutankhamun? January 1323 BC. The ancient chroniclers record a tragedy.
The great portals were shut. The courtiers were head on knee. The people mourned.
A living god, a beloved leader, the pharaoh, is dead. To compound the tragedy, the pharaoh is young, his death sudden. Whenever death comes too soon, suspicion is never far behind. The body is barely cold, and already rumors of foul play creep through the palace. As they prepare the pharaoh for burial, the royal morticians wisely keep their hands busy and their mouths shut. Outside a hastily finished tomb, the final rites of the dead are performed by the king's favorite minister and his young wife. In the Valley of the Kings, the pharaoh's body is entombed for eternity. So, it's hoped, is the secret of his death. 3,000 years after Tutankhamun's death, two of America's top detectives are reopening the casebook on the death of the young pharaoh. Can modern investigative techniques solve the mystery behind the boy king's premature death? Mike King and Greg Cooper think so. Cooper and King have cracked some of the toughest murder cases in modern crime. But trying to solve a 3,000-year-old murder will present its own difficulties.
When a police officer shows up at a death scene, the first response is to secure that area so that forensics experts can come in and gather those very specific clues. Unfortunately, with Tutankhamun, we don't have that opportunity to go and secure something that occurred more than 3,000 years ago.
Tens of thousands of tourists visit Tut's tomb every year. Most overlook the clues a trained eye seeks.
We're attempting to recreate the cause of his death and the manner of his death. And when you do so through every means that's available to you. What we have is a burial site to begin with. And so it becomes important to look at that particular location to determine if there's any artifacts that may suggest the method and manner of his death.
The disposal site, Tut's tomb, was discovered in 1922. It took archaeologist Howard Carter more than 5 years to find it.
The decisive moment had arrived. With trembling hands, I made a tiny breach in the upper left-hand corner. At first, I could see nothing, but presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, I was struck dumb with amazement.
Howard Carter had made one of the greatest discoveries of all time, the intact treasures of an Egyptian pharaoh. Carter's find, and the way Tut's corpse was removed from the tomb, will have a direct bearing on the detective's investigation. Unaware he had stumbled on the scene of a crime, Carter began removing the tomb's contents piece by piece. Unknowingly, he was tampering with evidence. Fortunately, before removing the artifacts, Carter meticulously catalogued every item, leaving the detectives a treasure trove of clues. Every homicide investigation begins with a body. Thanks to the ancient Egyptian practice of mummification, Tutankhamun's body survived 30 centuries. Recovering the mummy from the tomb took Howard Carter 3 years of painstaking excavation. Like a Russian doll, the pharaoh's sarcophagus nested within a series of shrines. Once Carter recovered the corpse, he wanted to establish the cause of death. In 1925, he invited a leading British anatomy professor, Douglas Derry, to autopsy Tut. Cooper and King returned to Derry's report. They're searching for clues he overlooked. They've brought in their own medical expert. Ernst Rodin is a professor of neurology at the University of Utah. Long fascinated by Tutankhamun, he's been piecing together medical evidence on the pharaoh's death for more than 20 years.
Howard Carter's prime interest as an archaeologist are the artifacts and not a medical examination.
To remove the pharaoh's body from its coffin, Derry resorted to drastic measures.
They found that the bottom of the second coffin and the sides were glued with a resin that had hardened over the millennia, and they could not extract the second coffin from the real gold coffin. And in addition, the mummy was solidly glued to the bottom of the third coffin.
Carter and Derry removed the coffin outside, in the hope the Egyptian sun would melt the hardened resin used in the embalming.
Nothing happened, unsuccessful.
Next, Derry tried slicing through the resin with knives. Still no luck. Tutankhamun was stuck fast.
So then they decided there is no other way to get at this body but to literally chisel it out. In the process, they had to dismember the body.
Derry severed Tutankhamun's head, sliced through his abdomen, and ripped his limbs from his body. Critical forensic evidence was destroyed. Derry failed to establish a cause of death, but one part of his report still intrigues the detectives.
On the left cheek, just in front of the earlobe, is a round depression, the skin filling it resembling a scab. Round the circumference of the depression, which has slightly raised edges, the skin is discolored.
Some experts believe the lesion is evidence of an arrow wound. Rodin advances a different explanation. Less sensational, but for Tutankhamun, potentially lethal.
It is also possible with the insects that are around that there was an insect bite, and as a result of the insect bite, he might have developed sepsis.
Did Tutankhamun die of natural causes? So far, Cooper and King think it's unlikely.
The fact that he was young, that he had the best of care and the best of protection, it wouldn't lead us to believe or conclude, probably anyway, that he died from natural causes. If he lived until he was 18 years old, the chances of him living an exceedingly long life, or at least consistent with the rest of the pharaohs, which generally most of them lived to an old age, would have been consistent and common for him as well. We would expect the same thing.
The detectives are puzzled by the way Tutankhamun was interred. All the evidence suggests he was buried in a hurry. A rushed burial doesn't square with death by natural causes.
If this was a king who became ill and over time passes away, if that were the case, then the evidence wouldn't support by a speedy burial and a rushed tomb preparation.
It was unexpected, and they didn't have time to plan for it. Why? He either died from an accident or homicide.
To uncover hard evidence about Tutankhamun's death, the detectives turn to the crime scene itself. First stop, Tutankhamun's tomb. For ancient Egyptians, the pictures painted in their tombs served as a last testament to the gods. Perhaps they'll offer clues to Tut's life and death. The Egyptian authorities have given Cooper and King special clearance to enter the lower chamber, off limits to most visitors.
By looking at the behavior, whether it be through the crime scene or the disposal site in this case, or the types of caricatures that we find within the walls of the tombs, I think we'll see a real indication of what kind of things were going on at that time politically, religiously, and I think emotionally.
For the detectives, the burial vault is a treasure trove of clues, a place they'll return to time and again.
Look at this, Mike. It appears to be the top of a sarcophagus.
Isn't it interesting that it doesn't match the stone and the inlay and the design?
It's clearly inconsistent, isn't it? Which suggests what? Something of a hurried fashion that was incomplete. And then here we've got some splashing of some of this paint, this reddish paint. I wonder why that wasn't cleaned up.
This isn't something that would be easily overlooked in the course of painting a tomb like this, and it would seem that you could certainly paint over the top of that.
It's as if they never even saw it, or didn't sufficiently care, or they were in such a hurry they didn't see it.
You would almost question whether it was shoddy workmanship, and would that be appropriate for a pharaoh? Look at this.
Look at the unguents there, how they seem to have spilled over or leaked out. I wonder why that wasn't cleaned up immediately after it occurred.
Cooper and King are convinced the undue haste with which Tut was buried points to a cover-up.
He's just been not just disposed of, but just cast aside like he never existed. And that causes a very significant question, especially considering who he was.
Their conclusion is shared by the last man who looked on the face of the boy king, a man whose evidence will prove invaluable to the detectives. In 1968, Professor R.G. Harrison of Liverpool University led an expedition into Tut's tomb to X-ray the pharaoh's remains. Harrison followed in the wake of Douglas Derry, who autopsied the mummy 40 years before, in vain. Harrison believed advances in medicine would help pinpoint the cause of Tutankhamun's death. Harrison's own theory: tuberculosis. When Harrison X-rayed Tutankhamun's head, he found something even more dramatic. At the base of the skull, Harrison noticed an abnormal density, like a blood clot.
This is within normal limits, but in fact it could have been caused by a hemorrhage under the membranes overlying the brain in this region. And this being caused by a blow on the back of the head, and this in turn could have been responsible for death.
Harrison's examination was the last allowed by the Egyptian authorities, and the first to suggest Tut's death was no accident. 25 years on, copies of Harrison's X-rays have been released to Cooper and King for their investigation.
Oh, here you go, Doctor.
Vital evidence for the detectives.
These are the X-rays on Tutankhamun that we talked to you about and need some opinions on.
All right.
The X-rays give Cooper and King a rare chance for a second opinion. They've asked Dr. Todd Gray, Chief Medical Examiner of Salt Lake City, to re-examine the X-rays. Gray is no stranger to homicide. Together, he and the detectives have worked on a lot of murders. Gray is puzzled by a loose chip of bone, clearly visible in the upper left side of the skull. During mummification, embalmers used a sharp instrument to remove the brains from the skull via the nose. Could they have chipped this bone loose during the embalming?
You don't normally in the embalming process knock bone fragments out, even though they are going up through the ethmoid plate. And that raises the possibility that there may have been some pre-existing fractures in this area that led to this bone being more easily dislodged in whatever processes went through, for example.
But if the embalming didn't dislodge the bone fragment, what did? The blow to the back of the head noted by Harrison.
How could the impact from the back of the head impact that bone that's floating there?
Good question. It's a phenomenon called the contra-coup phenomena. When the moving head comes backwards and strikes a fixed object, what happens is the brain actually first impacts the skull towards the front. What you see are black eyes and fractures of the very thin bones that sit over the top of the eyes. And if there were fractures there and then subsequent manipulations were occurring, that piece of bone could quite easily be the remnant or artifact of what may have been pre-existing pathology.
In other words, the bones could have been loosened during the embalming, but they were broken before. These injuries, coupled with Tut's youth, suggest he died under suspicious circumstances.
He's a young individual. Young individuals don't just up and die suddenly and unexpectedly, even in ancient times. This was the peak of life for somebody like him.
So based upon your review, do you have a conclusion as to whether or not we can determine the cause and or manner of death?
I don't think I can give you a hard and fast like I would with a multiple gunshot wound homicide. But I can say that there are enough suspicious findings in this so that your investigative work needs to focus on whatever other evidence you may have that can help prove that this was a non-natural death.
As the detectives build the case for murder, they enlist another expert for a closer look at the victim. Dr. Robin Richards of the Department of Medical Physics, University College London, uses 3D computer imaging to recreate facial features from skull measurements. Using the data gathered by Cooper and King, Richards undertakes an unparalleled challenge to recreate the real face of Tutankhamun.
These forensic reconstruction techniques are used by a number of different people to reconstruct found skulls where there are identification problems, typically from the police. The skull that we are working from has been reconstructed from X-ray views of the individual.
While Dr. Richards starts to map the pharaoh's skull, the detectives pursue their investigation. Their case enters a new chapter. It will involve innovative techniques pioneered by the FBI and frequently used by Cooper and King.
What we will attempt to introduce through our investigation is behavioral evidence. And that is what's happening in the life of Tutankhamun. What are the circumstances? What's the situation, the environment, the political realities, the religious background, etc. And any historical facts that we have to look into it as well.
Ancient Egypt was dominated by the principle of Ma'at, order, the regular flooding of the Nile, the rising and the setting of the sun, and the worship of many gods. For centuries before Tutankhamun's birth, the most important of these gods was Amun. Cooper and King have learnt that Amun's priests were the wealthiest and most influential people in the land. Their power grew so great it rivaled the pharaohs. In 1353 BC, a pharaoh came to the throne determined to break the power of the priests. He was Akhenaten, father of Tutankhamun. Akhenaten is admired by some scholars as one of the first people ever to embrace the idea of one god. According to one of the detective's key witnesses, in his own time, Akhenaten was viewed far differently.
To begin to understand Tutankhamun, we need to understand that he was the son of a powerful revolutionary leader, of a dictator. He was the son of a Joseph Stalin, of an Adolf Hitler.
Akhenaten would turn the world upside down and replace Egypt's gods with one supreme being. Little did he dream he'd set in motion the murder of his own son. Today, the Egyptian city of Amarna is populated only by ghosts. When Tutankhamun was born, it was the dazzling new capital of Egypt. To the ruins of this once great city, detectives Cooper and King travel seeking proof of Tut's murder. Was his death payback for the misdeeds of his father? The detectives are accompanied by armed guards and a police convoy. The trip takes the detectives 200 miles north of Tutankhamun's tomb. And back to the time of Tut's childhood. Reconstructing Tutankhamun's formative years in Amarna is the next step in creating what the detectives call a victimology. Tutankhamun was raised in Amarna.
During the course of a victimology study, we go back and look at everything that we can find out about the victim prior to the event, during the event, and after the event.
Amarna was built as Egypt's new capital by Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten. In 1348 BC, he led 50,000 people into the desert, leaving the old capital of Thebes far behind. In a little over 5 years, they transformed a wasteland into an oasis. The boundary stones marking the limits of Akhenaten's city still remain, carved into the surrounding cliffs. These stela offer a clue to Akhenaten's extremism.
Look at this boundary stela. It's incredible. As I understand the stela, that it is a sense of a reaffirmation of Akhenaten's belief and faith and devotion to one God rather than many.
Upsetting thousands of years of tradition, Tutankhamun's father replaced the worship of many gods with just one, the sun disk, the Aten. The self-appointed intermediary between this new god and the people of Egypt was none other than Akhenaten himself. Tutankhamun was born into revolutionary turmoil. To understand how Tut's father's religious upheaval might have affected the young prince, the detectives turn to a man who has compiled psychological profiles of some of the world's worst dictators and terrorists.
The world that Tutankhamun was born into would have been mind-boggling for any child. He was born in an artificial city, a city which his father created to preserve the illusion of immortality as well as his own invulnerability. Under those circumstances, Tut was a boy in a bubble of his father's creation.
Isolated from the outside world, it's likely Tutankhamun knew nothing of the reign of terror that many scholars like Joanne Fletcher believe his father instigated.
Akhenaten was a terrible politician who seriously mishandled just about everything in terms of running the country. He wanted to completely obliterate all trace of the state god, and in this way completely remove the power of the clergy that served the god.
By rejecting the old gods, Akhenaten made a host of mortal enemies. Unwittingly, believe the detectives, he created the circumstances for his son's murder. Recent discoveries in Amarna suggest a link between the turbulent reign of Akhenaten and his son's suspicious death. To learn more, the detectives question the man who knows this area better than anyone, Amarna's Chief Inspector of Antiquities. Emad El-Hamid has recently interpreted a wall carving that offers dramatic new evidence in the quest for Tutankhamun's killer. For centuries, the mural was hidden deep in a tomb that belonged to Akhenaten's chief of police. For Cooper and King, it's one of the most significant discoveries yet in their investigation.
We are in Mahu's tomb. Mahu was the chief of police in the reign of Akhenaten.
If I understand right, then the chief of police is sending his officers to try to arrest whoever attempts to kill Akhenaten. And they capture.
Mr. El-Hamid believes the carvings show the would-be assassins being tortured.
So in addition to the images that suggest that, we also have other historical documents reflecting the same story.
Do we know how many attempts were made on Akhenaten's life?
They tried to poison him.
So maybe two.
Maybe two or more.
Mr. El-Hamid reveals the culprits, the priests of Amun, guardians of the outlawed god. Over thousands of years, only 3 pharaohs are thought to have been assassinated. The revelation that priests conspired to kill Akhenaten introduces a twist into the inquiry. If they tried to murder the father, did they also go after the son? Akhenaten survived this attempt on his life, but 17 years after becoming pharaoh, he died. Victim of assassination? No one can say.
It's hard to know whether Tut would have felt grief as we conventionally understand grief at the loss of his father. Fear might have been a far likelier emotion. His idol is gone. Who's going to protect him?
The child Tutankhamun inherited a troubled throne.
It appears that the circumstances, the situation, the environment that he was in begins to raise his risk level to the point that it's reasonable at this point to assume that he becomes a target and potentially a political target for assassination.
Who lay behind such a conspiracy? The same Amun priests who tried to kill his father? Or did others conspire against the young king, waiting for the right moment to strike? Tutankhamun was crowned pharaoh of Egypt while still a boy.
When, at the age of 9, Tutankhamun is made king, clearly someone has made him king, or some group has made him king for their own purposes.
It's just not very realistic in my mind that he would have fully appreciated intellectually nor emotionally what his role was. He doesn't fully comprehend what it's all about, and what it's really all about is the nation and keeping the nation together. That seems to be exactly what this coronation accomplished.
Cooper and King believed from the moment he was crowned, the young pharaoh was manipulated by powerful forces behind the throne. Soon after ascending the throne, Tutankhamun left Amarna forever. He journeyed to Thebes, ancient capital of Egypt, and home to the priests of Amun.
this boy gets transported from an environment which was familiar to him, an environment which his father had created, to the big city, Thebes, a city where he was a stranger.
Tutankhamun didn't make the journey alone. With him went his young wife, Ankhesenamun. Ankhesenamun was more than a wife. She was also Tut's half-sister. They were married when Tutankhamun was about 9.
Tut's child wife was someone who herself had lived in the bubble that Akhenaten had created. When the two of them were transplanted to Thebes, not by their own means or by their own powers, but by other powers, they must have clung to each other very closely. Two refugees from a storm. It's touching to think that the one person who may have had Tut's interests at heart was his wife.
"3,000 years on, Kuper and King follow in the young pharaoh's wake. Tutankhamun moved to Thebes after being crowned pharaoh. Upon arriving, he was met by 3 men who would shape his every decision for the next decade. Maya, the chief treasurer. Horemheb, head of the army. And I, the prime minister, the second most powerful man in Egypt. The investigation hangs on building profiles of these 3 men.
What you have is a depiction of Horemheb. This is Horemheb.
What role did each play in the new pharaoh's life? As pharaoh, Tutankhamun had to prepare for the day he would lead troops into battle. It was the job of Horemheb, commander-in-chief, to instruct the young king in the arts of war. Nothing mattered more to the Egyptians than preparing for the afterlife. From the moment Tutankhamun became king, work began on his tomb. He planned to be buried in the West Valley near his grandfather. Overseeing this vital project was Maya, the royal treasurer, an official who would have seen the king almost daily. Finally, the young pharaoh had to master the rituals of the old religion. For centuries, the priesthood of Amun had dominated religious life. Now that Tut's heretic father was dead, they returned to power. No one was better qualified to instruct the king in religion than his prime minister. As a young man, I served as an Amun priest. Better than anyone, he grasped the need to make peace with the priesthood. As Kuper and King discovered, these same priests plotted to assassinate Tut's father. I was Akhenaten's prime minister too. Tut had known him all his life. With Akhenaten's death, it is likely the shrewd politician took on another role: surrogate father. The first political move by the king's counselors was a change of names. At Amarna, where the pharaoh and his wife grew up, both were named to honor the god Aten. Now they had to honor the old gods, particularly the god Amun. Tutankhaten, as the pharaoh had been known, became Tutankhamun. Ankhesenaten became Ankhesenamun. Cooper and King have discovered that to claim the throne, Tutankhamun was forced to publicly reject his father's beliefs. Re-establishing the old religion, he endorsed a commemorative tablet known as the Restoration Stela. It still survives, and its words damn Akhenaten and his heresy.
The temples of the gods and goddesses had fallen into neglect. Their shrines had fallen into desolation. The land was in confusion. The gods forsook this land.
Who could have been responsible for that kind of strategic political thinking in terms of bringing the kingdom back together again? And when you consider Tut being such a young man, it's most probable that that kind of maneuvering or manipulation, in a sense, from my perspective, would have been influenced by a number of other people, those who were very close to him, those who could appreciate the political issues and dynamics of the things that were occurring.
Cooper and King have discovered that to claim the throne, Tutankhamun was forced to publicly reject his father's beliefs. Re-establishing the old religion, he endorsed a commemorative tablet known as the Restoration Stela, and its words damn Akhenaten and his heresy.
Who would have written these words in stone which heap such scorn on King Tut's father? One initially might be drawn to the commander-in-chief of the army as a likely suspect because the guy has power. But he's not a man of words. There is one candidate who emerges as being a man of words, a man who succeeded in survival via words, via political intrigue, and that's I.
Maybe from a selfish perspective for the leaders who would be involved in this kind of a strategic move, it would be so that they could remain in power.
Tutankhamun seems merely a pawn of the men who ran his government.
There had to be some machine of political strategy behind him to recognize how important it was to keep the country together and how to do that. And that was to go back to the older ways.
As part of this strategy, new statues were commissioned depicting Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun as incarnations of the old god Amun and his wife Mut. Further proof to the detectives that both children became tools in a vast propaganda campaign. By restoring the old religion, Tutankhamun did everything asked of him and more. So why was he murdered? 3,000 miles away in London, work progresses on the real face behind the propaganda facade. Dr. Robin Richards' virtual skull of Tutankhamun is almost complete, its distinctive features highlighted by a series of points.
But we haven't filled in the spaces between those points on the surface. So we need some contour between the points. And the way we do it here is because we've got the scanner system, we can scan faces. And so we can scan a shape of a face, but it won't necessarily match the skull that we're trying to reconstruct.
These reconstructive techniques are regularly used by Cooper and King to recreate the face of a murder victim.
What we then do is we distort that face, we warp it, so that the appropriate points on the face pass through the points that we've derived from the skull.
Aided by volunteers, Richard's next stage is to create a skin to be wrapped around the skull. Soon, Cooper and King will gaze on the man in the golden mask. Back in Thebes, the detectives search for more clues about the real power behind Tut's throne. They home in on an event called the Opet Festival, a public celebration that marked Tutankhamun's transition from his father's religion back to the former state god Amun.
This is really a celebration of a restoration, in a sense.
Although it was an annual event throughout Egyptian history, it had been suspended during Akhenaten's reign. So the first time this was celebrated after Akhenaten's reign was a time of immense celebration. You can imagine the people, the sheer delight that the gods had come back to them and that the king was once again performing the rituals that they'd always known for millennia.
The Opet festival transformed Tutankhamun from a mere boy to a living god. But did his newfound authority upset the status quo?
He develops his own approach to things as he recognizes who he is and what his role is, and he does so naturally. How do those around him who have been in power for so long react to that? How do they receive it? Is it supportive or not?
The detectives believe the Opet festival was a watershed. For the first time in his life, Tutankhamun sensed his own power. In turn, the detectives think the boy's growing confidence prompted the murderer to act.